Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and today we're going to be talking about the idea of punching with a knuckle bow or a basket hilt. So it's a simple thing. I keep seeing it all over in movies, television. I've seen people talking about it when they're selling reproduction and antique swords and other things. But let's look functionally at the idea of a punch. So if you don't know, that's basically I have something like this, which is a knuckle bow. This is a reproduction small sword, so you'll see it's got this extension of the hilt, which is just one bar. Anything up to one of these sorts of basket hilts, and even ones you see on a mortuary sword or a Scottish broadsword, that gives 180 degrees of a basket. Regardless, the same concept will apply to all of them. But let's look at some of these sorts of swords. So for something like this, which is a small sword, it's essentially designed as a thrusting weapon. So, of course, I need hardly mention that swords are usually designed to cut and or thrust. So you've got all of those sorts of actions at distance. So hopefully I should be able to skip over with you guys that you don't need to do something like a punch at distance, because this punch reaches this far, whereas my blade reaches that far. So we can skip to the fact that this sort of action would be used close up. So this is when we reach the standard close play where various things can happen. People might grab the other person's sword, so let's say I'm close up, I've done some sort of parry when they tried to cut. I might grab their weapon, say at the hilt or at the base of the blade. I might grab their hand, I might be able to go in closer and do something like an arm lock, or I might even be trying to wrestle and throw them right up close, pretty much your sort of hugging distance, for lack of a better term. So at that sort of range, yes, one of the things you can do is utilise the sword. I mean, there are some instances in close play where, at least in treatises, it's mentioned that sometimes a person will drop their sword entirely when they reach that range, and they might switch to something like a dagger, or just straight up only use their fists and do unarmed combat. So you'll be punching, kicking, wrestling, grappling, locks, throws, disarms, takedowns, and all of that kind of stuff you could see in most unarmed martial arts. But assuming you keep the sword and you're looking at options like the punch, I've always considered it to be a very ineffective way to use the weapon. Because let's say I have bound up with someone's weapon, maybe it was part of an attack I did that failed and they parried it, or perhaps they attempted an attack on me and I parried it, or perhaps I've even just immediately gone to close in for the grapple. Perhaps I realise that they lack confidence and they'll be backpedaling, so if I charge at them I'll gain some initiative, assuming I don't get stabbed on the way in. Then I can start looking at things like you trying to do using the sword from the 40 and slice along for a draw cut. Might be half swording, which is where you grab the blade part way up, try to manipulate in there. Pommel striking, and of course the punch. Now, you might notice that most of the time when I'm talking about supposedly punching with the knuckle guard, this entire time I've been talking about not punching with the knuckle guard. And that's because I think it's, like I said, a poor idea. So if I'm in a range where I have the option to, let's say I'm around on their sword, we're perhaps bound up, and then I can do the punch and go around and go, ugh, swing around and knock them, perhaps smack them in the jaw with it. Perhaps even go around and do something like an uppercut, so I'm punching upwards. Those sorts of things you do as a punch. But the question I ponder is, why do that? If I wish to do something highly damaging, I could perhaps grab their sword, go around and see if I can angle in for something like a thrust, especially if I can gain the distance again, perhaps by stepping back or stepping around the opponent. If we're too close for that, then I could do something like go around their weapon and use the pommel, or I can even do things like use the actual hilt and hook around, and there are various options you can do from there. If you look at things like Fiore's half sword, for example, it's something designed for medieval European swords that didn't have the knuckle bow. The same concept applies. You can be parried on or bound with their sword in whatever direction. You're then hooking around and you're using the hilt of the weapon around the blade of their weapon, and you can start to manipulate, and it helps to facilitate disarms and takedowns and binds and things like that as you see fit. But with a punch, I don't feel like it's very mechanically efficient. It's not something that's going to do much compared to other options. If I'm bound, let's say here, and I go, ugh, there's kind of a degree of a punch that I can manage. And yes, I'm not quite so impeded, maybe even slightly helped by whatever's bound up with my blade. But it really depends. If I'm bound up sort of further away around here, which this part of the sword is called the foible, which is the weak for binding, so I'm more likely to get pushed out of the way, yes, I've got a lot more of a leverage so I can go around and try to smack them. But if I'm at that distance with their weapon, even if they're right up to their forte, the hilt, this is the area close to the hilt, say here, then I could still just go around and cut them, or go around and launch a thrust. You know, it's a sword. Why would I want to use it in a not sword way? If I wanted something that punches someone, I'd have, you know, things like brass knuckles on, or if I wanted to get that sort of close stuff, I'd use a dagger. It's a sword, you know? Cut. Thrust. All of that stuff. In fact, if it's the other way around, and I've ended up on the forte, and it's their foible, then I can manipulate them, and I can just push their blade. Haha! I've got you. Really simple stuff. No need for all this brawling stuff. You know, laconic and simple, that's the way you should do sword fighting. Not whirl around all day long and flail off into the sunset. But in the distance where it is more viable, we'd be closer, so it might be more like forte on forte. So both of us pretty much at the hilt, well, around the middle or lower, far closer to the hilt. In which case, if I'm wanting to go around, notice this isn't really a punching distance anymore. It's, you know, something where I've got very little room to move. It's more like a 1-inch punch rather than a proper smack. And then at that point, it naturally gravitates to something you actually see in the treatises, which is just a pommel strike, which you don't have to have a medieval round pommel to do it effectively. You know, you just go around, here around, there's a line, bang! Done. You know. So the difference being, rather than using the knuckle bow or the basket to go around for something more like, in boxing terms, perhaps a hook or an uppercut, I just go around and I just use the pommel almost like an upside down dagger or spear. And with some, especially medieval weapons, you can see instances, at least I've seen in the treatises, of things like spiked pommels. So it goes around, and rather than just being a lump which is good for smacking something, which is effective already, you've got something that actively spikes the opponent. Wonderful. So with something like a knuckle bow, you know, spreading the force over a larger area, I've got this whole, I mean, for lack of a better term, let's call this basket a sort of metal glove. It's a broad area, it spreads the force, and I go BAM! There's kind of some force and pushing, might knock the opponent sideways. You know, I'm not doubting that it would be an effective strike. It would be something that could do damage. But again, there are so many better options. If I'm doing something more like a pommel strike, instead of focusing all the force around this, or indeed, you know, something that should be more concentrated and deal more damage, like this bar, I can instead use something like a pommel, bang! Notice, just jut it forward and then hit the opponent. Now there's something else you might notice as well. All of this so far, with the punch, I've been doing from my right, because that's the best way to execute that kind of punch. Now let's go for what I think is even worse. So instead of parrying like that. So let's say I'm cutting from my left and I get parried, or someone attacks on my right, I parry them, and I'm going around with that kind of punch. What if it's the opposite side? So let's say I've cut from my right, or I'm defending on my left, which happens a lot more often if two right-handed opponents use, you know, weapons against each other. So this is something even more likely to happen in most fights. Trying to punch from this, I think, is really awkward. So let's say we've bound up here. So I've got maximum leverage to do the punch. I'm trying to kind of go, ugh. I don't know about you, maybe I'm just not a good enough martial artist and I'm just crap at everything. But trying to do that, I can't imagine that being a very powerful punch, or even with an uppercut. I'm kind of, you know, I can't go too much into a proper kind of position for an uppercut, because at that point I'm having to kind of disengage from the bind, and either, you know, I'm able to do something else, like cut them, or stab them like I'm supposed to with a sword, or if I'm not doing that, by releasing from them, they're going to cut or stab you instead, because that's how swords work. So I have to stay bound and try to kind of go around their sword, which is again why you see something like a pommel strike. So I might be here, bound up, inside guard in British military sabre, I've parried, I think, I'm going to close with the opponent, scoop around, have the blade go over my head, just bring it so I'm still binding and controlling their blade, and then I then use the butt, pommel, whatever I've got on hand, and then strike them in the face. Or, like I said, I go around and I turn it into a normal sword action, which I don't need to have a lot of swinging room to do that, because a lot of swords, one of the key advantages of swords, which I talked about in a previous video compared to things like axes and maces and such things, is that they have a blade all the way along the length. So even if I'm really close, I could go around, place the blade, let's say on their neck, slice out. So I don't need to actually chop them, I can just gently place the blade, draw along, and I'm done. I don't need to try this, you know, kind of, I mean, what's this? Could you imagine even putting this in a movie scene? Seriously? Best equivalent you could do is some sort of punching action to bring their sword out, but then we're back to sword actions again. So I've parried, inside guard, curl around, maybe even scoop it lower if I should so see, depending on what range you're at and other factors, and then start to push their sword out because I have the leverage with my forte, and then do something like a cut or thrusty and, you know, angle it for those things. And additionally, I mentioned earlier, half sword, so parry, go around, really easy to stab something from there. And these are the actions you actually see in the treatises. You know, it's not just that I'm making this all up from my head or from some imagination, I have no idea what I'm talking about. Yes, I've never been in a real sword fight, let's be honest. I've done martial arts and I've done fighting with swords, but it's all been fun and a bit of sparring. But these people who actually had to kill people and avoid being killed with real swords that were actually sharp, wrote these things down. I have yet to find any examples. Please show me some information if I'm wrong, if there's anything that you've found. But I personally have never found an instance where you use specifically the basket or the bow to punch an opponent. Every instance I've ever seen has been doing the other actions that I've already mentioned. You know, things like, most especially, anything where in the movies it would be a punch, it's been a pommel or butt strike. Again, because it's just better. It works better mechanically, it works better tactically, does more damage, it's safer. Why not do it? Why punch people? Why break your weapon? You know, especially the hilt doing that. I don't know. That's my thought. Thank you for watching, and see you all later. Goodbye.